It begins softly. The gaslight flickers in the hall. A distant clock ticks, slow and deliberate, counting the seconds of a world that has long fallen asleep. Outside, London's fog rolls like a ghostly tide, wrapping every street and corner in a velvet silence. And within that silence, behind the tall windows and heavy curtains, the lives of Victorian wives unfold, unseen, unheard, and often misunderstood. To the world beyond those lace-covered windows, they were symbols of grace, virtue, and devotion. But within the dim corridors of their homes, the story was far more delicate, far more human. The clinking of teacups, the rustle of petticoats, the faint sighs behind closed doors, all whispered a quiet tale of loneliness and duty, of love that was never fully theirs to own. The Victorian wife was both revered and restrained. She was the keeper of domestic peace, the silent architect of moral order. Her smile was her armor, her patience a quiet rebellion. But the truth of her days, the truth, was one of constant negotiation between desire and decorum, between the heart's wildness and society's iron hand. Each morning began with ritual. Before dawn, maids would light fires in the grates, the cold room slowly breathing to life. The mistress would rise, often before her husband, to oversee breakfast preparations, to review the household accounts, to ensure every servant was in place. Her world was a theater of routine, and she, the leading lady who could never falter. Even her body was bound to the laws of the age, corsets drawn tight until breath itself became a luxury. Gowns layered in silk and bone and lace. Every gesture had to be graceful, every expression modest. The Victorians believed that a woman's virtue was visible in her posture. Straight spine, quiet voice, eyes lowered just enough to suggest purity, but not ignorance. And yet, within that polished silence, so many thoughts swirled. The letters unwritten, the passions unspoken, the dreams of something beyond the parlor walls. They looked at the garden, roses tended by other hands, and wondered if freedom, too, was a flower they were not meant to touch. Marriage was rarely the romantic sanctuary it appeared to be. It was a contract, elegant, yes, but binding in ways that reached the soul. Love, when it came like a whisper between duties, but more often it was replaced by obligation, by expectation, by the quiet surrender that the age called womanly virtue. Victorian men believed themselves to be protectors, but protection in that era meant control. A wife's property, her earnings, even her children, all legally belonged to her husband. She was, in the eyes of the law, both cherished and owned. And so she learned the art of silence. She learned to smile when she wanted to cry, to nod when she wished to scream. The more refined her restraint, the more society praised her. Evenings were long and dimly lit. Gaslight shimmered across the parlor walls as the husband read aloud from the newspaper, the wife quietly sewing, her mind elsewhere. The ticking clock, the faint hum of the city outside, these were the companions of her solitude. Sometimes she would pause, needle in hand, staring into the soft glow of the fire. Her reflection in the window seemed like another woman entirely, someone she might have been in another time, another life. There were unspoken rules for everything. How she should address her husband in public, how she should never contradict him, even in private, how her laughter should never be too loud, her step never too heavy. Every moment was choreography, a performance for an audience that never applauded. But beneath that restraint, a quiet revolution brewed. Through the written word, women began to find their voices. Letters between friends became small sanctuaries of honesty. Journals, hidden beneath mattresses or behind locked drawers, held confessions too dangerous to speak aloud. They wrote about their fears, their loneliness, their longing for something beyond the delicate prisons of lace and civility. And so the Victorian home, with all its beauty and order, became both sanctuary and cell, a world where the fire's warmth could never quite reach the heart, where laughter echoed softly and dreams faded with the light. Some nights, when the streets were quiet and even the servants had gone to bed, a wife would wander through her darkened home, touching the cold glass of the window, listening to the city's distant hum. She would think of the girl she once was, free, foolish, full of hope, and wonder when that girl had disappeared. The candlelight would flicker, and she would whisper to no one, "Is this all there is?" But there were moments of tenderness too, moments when her husband's hand brushed hers at supper, when a child's laughter filled the hall, and the morning sun caught the edge of the lace curtain and filled the room with gold. In those moments, life felt bearable, even beautiful, because beauty for the Victorian wife was not freedom, it was endurance made graceful. And so the world turned. Season after season, the same rituals repeated. Spring cleaning, garden teas, evening calls, church Sundays. Through them all, women moved like shadows in silk, graceful, composed, eternal. But behind those eyes, behind those perfectly tied ribbons, lay stories that the world would not hear for another century. Gently, marking another hour in the endless rhythm of a Victorian household. The sound of footsteps, light, measured, almost hesitant, echoes through polished corridors. Behind those elegant doors and painted smiles, most wives lived within what the poets called a gilded cage, beautiful, refined, but quietly suffocating. In the mid-1800s, marriage was less about love and more about duty. For many women, it was the only acceptable path in life. Education for girls focused on etiquette, embroidery, and piano, not ambition or independence. Their worth was measured not by intellectual might, but by obedience and grace. Each morning began before sunrise. She would dress in tight corsets, drawn until her breath grew shallow, layers of petticoats, silk gowns, and gloves. A symbol of refinement, yes, but also of restraint. The body itself became a metaphor for the control society demanded. After breakfast, the lady of the house supervised servants, organizing meals, cleaning schedules, floral arrangements. Even in wealthy homes, she was expected to manage quietly, never complain, and always smile. Her husband's career, her children's education, her social appearances, all these things defined her success. Outside the house, London hummed with industrial progress, trains roaring, smoke rising, men debating politics and science. Inside, the drawing rooms were filled with whispers, embroidery needles clicking softly, teacups clinking in fragile hands, conversations circling endlessly around decorum and propriety. Loneliness was a constant. Doctors of the time even diagnosed women with hysteria, a term used for everything from sadness to rebellion. The cure, they said, was rest, silence, and obedience, as if freedom itself was the disease. And yet, beneath those lace collars and fragile smiles, some women began to awaken. They read secretly poetry, philosophy, and novels that spoke of independence. They began to question why their hearts longed for something more than domestic peace. Every night, when the lamps dimmed and the city fell asleep, countless wives lay awake, staring into the dark velvet ceiling, wondering what their lives might have been had they been born as men. And so the world outside called it the Victorian Golden Age, but for many women, it was a quiet century of unseen sorrow. Behind the delicate lace curtains and polished teapots, there lived a silence far heavier than the velvet drapes that covered every window. The Victorian home, so outwardly perfect, often hid the quiet suffering of its mistress. Each morning began not with joy, but with duty. The wife rose before the house stirred, her corset laced so tightly that even her breath belonged to someone else. Every gesture, pouring tea, adjusting flowers, smiling through fatigue, was a performance in the grand theater of respectability. Her world was confined to drawing rooms and nursery walls. The husband, master of the household, commanded authority in every word and silence. For many women, marriage was not companionship, it was containment, a lifetime contract written by society, sealed by law, and sanctified by the Church. Doctors of the era often dismissed women's depression as nervous hysteria. Their prescription? More rest, less thought, and sometimes confinement in asylums. The mind, like the body, was not their own to control. But within these quiet prisons, sparks of rebellion began to glimmer. Some wives started to read forbidden books, poetry, science, philosophy in secret. Others kept diaries, pouring their pain onto paper no one was meant to see. The whisper of pens across parchment became the sound of awakening. The beauty of the Victorian age was often built upon invisible labor and invisible sorrow. Yet even in silence, the women of that time carried a strength beyond measure. They endured, adapted, and slowly began to question the walls built around them. In the stillness of their rooms, beneath the ticking of ornate clocks and the scent of fading roses, history's quiet revolution was taking root, not with swords or banners, but with thought. The Victorian wife, once silenced, was beginning to listen to her own voice. Behind the delicate lace curtains and polished teapots, there lived a silence far heavier than the velvet drapes that covered every window. The Victorian home, so outwardly perfect, often hid the quiet suffering of its mistress. Each morning began not with joy, but with duty. The wife rose before the house stirred, her corset laced so tightly that even her breath belonged to someone else. Every gesture, pouring tea, adjusting flowers, smiling through fatigue, was a performance in the grand theater of respectability. Her world was confined to drawing rooms and nursery walls. The husband, master of the household, commanded authority in every word and silence. For many women, marriage was not companionship, it was containment, a lifetime contract written by society, sealed by law, and sanctified by the Church. Doctors of the era often dismissed women's depression as nervous hysteria. Their prescription? More rest, less thought, and sometimes confinement in asylums. The mind, like the body, was not their own to control. But within these quiet prisons, sparks of rebellion began to glimmer. Some wives started to read forbidden books, poetry, science, philosophy in secret. Others kept diaries, pouring their pain onto paper no one was meant to see. The whisper of pens across parchment became the sound of awakening. The beauty of the Victorian age was often built upon invisible labor and invisible sorrow. Yet even in silence, the women of that time carried a strength beyond measure. They endured, adapted, and slowly began to question the walls built around them. In the stillness of their rooms, beneath the ticking of ornate clocks and the scent of fading roses, history's quiet revolution was taking root, not with swords or banners, but with thought. The Victorian wife, once silenced, was beginning to listen to her own voice. When you imagine a Victorian home, perhaps you see a large mansion with chandeliers, shining floors, and a lady in a long gown smiling faintly beside a piano. But behind that perfect picture, there often existed something darker, a quiet loneliness that no one spoke of. The Victorians loved appearances. Every curtain, every polished cup, every little gesture was part of a world built not on comfort, but on control. For women, especially wives, happiness was not something to be felt, it was something to be performed. A morning in the gilded cage. The day began early. Before the sun even touched the frost-covered windows, the housemaid had already lit the fire in the mistress's room. She would wake slowly, eyes heavy from a night spent thinking rather than sleeping. Her bed, though made of silk, felt like a prison cell. The first task was always appearance. A proper Victorian lady must never look tired, never appear disheveled. Her hair was brushed until it shone, her corset tightened until breathing became a quiet act of endurance. Her dress, layers upon layers, symbolized her respectability, but also her entrapment. By breakfast, the husband would appear, well-rested, ready to discuss business or politics. The wife would pour his tea, smile politely, and speak only when spoken to. This ritual of politeness was not affection, it was expectation. In the Victorian world, the ideal woman was not supposed to have too many thoughts of her own. A woman's intelligence was to be hidden like an ankle beneath her long dress, not denied, but never displayed. In public, Victorian wives were often praised as angels of the house. They represented purity, patience, and quiet obedience. But in private diaries and secret letters, we see another picture, a woman questioning her worth, her purpose, and her identity. Many felt trapped between two lives, the one they lived and the one they dreamed of. The piano in the drawing room was not just for music, it was a symbol. A wife was expected to play beautifully, but never too passionately, never too loudly. Even her emotions had to follow social rules. Doctors often described women's sadness as female weakness. They prescribed cold baths, tonics, or even months of rest cure, where the patient was forbidden to write, read, or think too deeply. One writer, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, later described this in her haunting story, The Yellow Wallpaper. It was based on her own suffering, a chilling portrayal of how society could turn care into confinement. Secrets behind closed doors. Not every husband was cruel. Many were simply shaped by the beliefs of their time, that a woman's role was to nurture and obey. But even gentle men were often blind to the quiet despair beside them. A Victorian wife was financially dependent, socially monitored, and legally invisible. She could not vote, could not own property after marriage, and had very limited rights over her own body. If she left her husband, she would lose her children, her home, her reputation, everything. So she stayed. She smiled at dinner. She entertained guests, and when the lights went out, she sometimes cried silently into the same pillow where her husband slept. The house as a mirror. Every object in the Victorian home told a story. The clock that ticked endlessly in the hallway, a reminder that time belonged not to her, but to routine. The lace curtains, delicate yet suffocating. The drawing room, a stage where she performed the illusion of happiness every day. Sometimes her only moments of freedom came in the garden. There, under the open sky, she could breathe a little deeper, listen to the wind, and remember who she once was before marriage. Some would secretly plant flowers, not just for beauty, but as small acts of defiance, silent symbols of life beyond the walls. The language of silence. Evenings were long and filled with polite emptiness. Guests would come, discuss the latest inventions or the Queen's speeches, while the women listened quietly, refilling teacups. But sometimes, amid the laughter and candlelight, two wives would exchange a look, a brief, wordless understanding. They knew. They all knew. Many women turned to writing. They wrote poetry under pen names, stories hidden inside sewing boxes, journals no one was supposed to find. Their words were whispers of rebellion, the early breath of feminism taking shape in ink and paper. The Quiet Revolution. By the late 1800s, something began to shift. Education slowly opened its doors to women. A few brave voices, writers like Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot, and the Bronte sisters, began to question what feminine virtue really meant. Through their novels, they portrayed women who felt, who thought, who desired freedom. These stories were radical for their time. They planted the first seeds of change in a society built on silence. Still, the majority of wives lived quietly in that gilded cage, graceful, admired, and unseen. Even as the century turned, the echoes of their footsteps lingered in the marble halls and dimly lit corridors of history. When you close your eyes tonight and imagine that world, think of the women who lived their entire lives behind closed doors, who smiled in portraits but never smiled in peace, who followed every rule and yet felt forgotten by the world they helped to build. Their story is not loud. It is a whisper, a sigh beneath the sound of a ticking clock. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful cages are still cages. When the world outside London's gas lamps fell silent, and the cobblestone streets turned pale under the moon, the houses of the Victorian wives became small prisons of sighs. Behind each lace curtain a story was waiting, of a woman sitting by the window, her hands resting on her lap, her thoughts wandering to a youth she could never return to. Her husband had gone to the club again. It was what men did: drink brandy, smoke cigars, talk of politics, while wives stayed home, counting minutes by the clock's tired ticking. Inside those dimly lit rooms, the wallpaper whispered secrets of decades gone by. A baby cried in the next room, a sound muffled quickly, for the nurse had been told, "Do not wake the master." And so silence became law. Even sorrow had to be quiet. Even dreams had to whisper. The wives read poetry by candlelight, sometimes writing small notes they'd never send, tucking them away in drawers, beneath linen and forgotten jewelry. Each word a heartbeat, each tear an invisible rebellion. The night stretched long, with the sound of carriage wheels fading in the distance. Sometimes they'd sit before the mirror, their reflection pale and tired, wondering when exactly their life had stopped being their own. To be a Victorian wife was to be a statue, beautiful, silent, and trapped inside duty. Even love had a rule book, and tenderness had an hour to expire. When dawn came, they would rise again, fix their hair, button their dresses, and wear their practiced smile, the one society demanded, the one that said, "I am fine." But the truth? They were ghosts walking in daylight, haunted not by death, but by the lives they could never live. When dawn came creeping over the gray chimneys of London, the city looked peaceful, almost innocent. But behind the delicate curtains and the lace-bound windows, there was a world that no man ever truly saw, a world of whispers, prescriptions, and pain. In the parlors of the wealthy, women sat quietly as the doctors arrived. Men in dark coats carrying black bags filled with little bottles. They called it medicine, but for many it was a quiet poison of obedience. The women drank bitter tonics made of iron, wine, and laudanum. They were told it would calm their nerves, that it would make them rest. And they did rest, too deeply, too long, too often. There was a sickness they spoke of only in soft voices, female hysteria. Doctors believed women became nervous because their emotions were too large, too wild to be contained. The cure? Silence, rest, isolation, and sometimes electricity. In small clinics far from public eyes, strange machines hummed and buzzed. Women were told it would make them calm again, that their minds would become quiet. But in truth, it only taught them to fear their own feelings. In the poor districts, the story was darker still. A mother might give birth alone, in a cold room smelling of damp cloth and candle smoke. There was no doctor, only a midwife, her hands trembling with exhaustion and faith. If the child lived, it was a miracle. If not, the mother whispered a prayer, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. The city itself seemed to feed on sorrow. Every street corner had its share of secrets, women who sold flowers by day and their dignity by night, just to buy bread for a child who might not live to see spring. And yet society looked away. They smiled in their polished carriages, attending tea parties and charity balls, while in the slums the sound of coughing babies filled the dawn air. Some women wrote letters to newspapers pleading for better hospitals, better laws, but most burned their words before morning, because in Victorian London a woman's silence was her duty, her suffering was her virtue. Even within the grand houses there was loneliness, a quiet kind of despair that clung to the walls. The wives were treated gently, spoken to kindly, but never truly seen. They smiled when spoken to, they laughed when expected, and cried only when no one was watching. At night, they pressed their palms against the cold glass of the window, watching the fog rise from the Thames. Some whispered prayers for freedom, others for death. Both were forms of escape. And yet, beneath all that sorrow, there was something beautiful, a soft strength that refused to die. These women endured, not with swords or speeches, but with patience, the kind of patience that becomes legend. They wrote secret diaries, hid names of lost children into handkerchiefs. They survived not because the world was kind, but because their souls were made of iron wrapped in lace. When history tells their story, it often forgets their names. But if you listen closely, in the stillness of the night, you can almost hear them breathing still. Through the pages of old letters, through the cracks in the wallpaper, through the gentle hum of time itself. They were not just wives, they were warriors of silence, and silence was the heaviest weapon they ever carried. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, soft and gray like the mist outside. The city beyond the windows was beginning to stir, but inside the house, time seemed to move differently, slower, careful, measured. Each tick of the grandfather clock echoed against the high ceilings, marking not merely the hours, but the patience of lives constrained. She sat at the vanity, brushing her hair in long, deliberate strokes, each one a rehearsal of grace. The reflection in the glass was familiar and strange. Eyes that had learned to watch the world without revealing themselves. a mouth trained to smile politely even when the heart protested. Breakfast was the same ritual as always. The husband read the newspaper aloud, his voice a steady monotone that filled the silence of the room. She poured the tea, arranged the toast and preserves with mechanical precision. And yet her mind wandered, always wandering, to thoughts she was not supposed to indulge. A daydream here, a memory there, a wish quietly tucked beneath her rib cage where no one could see it. The parlor was already humming with its familiar rhythm. The maid dusted the mantelpiece. The cook called instructions softly to the kitchen below. And somewhere the nurse hummed a lullaby to the child in the nursery. Every sound a note in the invisible symphony of domestic order, and she the silent conductor. But beneath the civility a storm brewed. Letters remained unfinished on the writing desk. Ink pooled into abstract confessions of hope, desire, and quiet desperation. Every word left unspoken was written instead in secret. Hidden pages, locked drawers, the silent communion of paper and pen. Her corset felt tighter than yesterday. She adjusted it with practiced hands, smiling at the mirror, smiling at herself, smiling for the world that never asked what lay behind those smiles. The body was a cage, yes, but it was also a testament to endurance, to patience, to the strange power of quiet survival. Outside, the fog rolled thicker. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along cobblestones, their sound muffled by the wet mist. In those streets, life seemed rough, loud, and unrefined. Inside, life was polished, controlled, and silent, but no less real for all its beauty. A visitor arrived in the late morning, a friend from another household. They exchanged pleasantries, a brief choreography of smiles and nods. But behind the polite conversation, something unsaid lingered. In one fleeting glance, she found recognition. Another woman, another prisoner of decorum, sharing the same quiet rebellion. In that glance there was comfort. In that silence there was communication. Words were unnecessary. They understood each other's fatigue, each other's yearning. And when the visitor departed, a small fire of courage remained, flickering faintly, just enough to remind her she was still alive within the gilded cage. Afternoon passed slowly. She wandered to the garden, her private sanctuary. Fingers grazed the petals of roses that were not truly hers, and she wondered if freedom was something that could bloom so quietly, unnoticed, in the shadow of expectation. Sometimes she imagined running beyond the gates, the corset undone, hair loose, heart unbound. But imagination, like the garden, had invisible walls. Evening fell with a hush. Candles were lit, the fire burned low, and the house exhaled its long, weary sigh. The husband returned, and conversation resumed its careful choreography. She smiled, nodded, laughed softly, an actress on a stage that stretched from dawn to dusk. But at night, when the house lay in stillness, she allowed herself a small indulgence. Journals were opened, letters begun, words spilled like secret rivers across the page. In ink, she could speak the thoughts that her lips never dared form. In writing, she was free, free to wonder, to dream, to grieve, to hope. The city slept, oblivious to the quiet revolutions within its walls. Women who seemed silent and composed by day were plotting in whispers by night. And though the world may never record their names, the spirit of their resistance was indelible. For every stitch in the hem of a gown, every measured smile, every whispered word on paper, these were acts of defiance. The Victorian wife, silenced in public, was finding her voice in the private chambers of her heart. And as the candle guttered and the fog pressed against the window pane, one truth remained. The strongest battles were often fought in silence, and the most enduring courage wore the guise of grace. Night settled like a velvet cloak over the city, muffling the sounds of London's streets. The gas lamps flickered faintly through the fog, casting long, wavering shadows across brick walls and cobblestones. Inside the houses, the world of the Victorian wife shifted, moving from visible restraint to the hidden spaces of thought, longing, and quiet courage. The house was mostly still. The servants had retreated to their quarters, their murmurs fading into the dark. Only the soft tick of clocks and the occasional whisper of wind through the curtains broke the silence. She moved carefully through the dim hallways, her slippered feet brushing against polished floorboards. Each step was measured, cautious, a dance of invisibility in the house she inhabited but rarely owned. In the nursery, a child slept peacefully, oblivious to the constraints that bound the mother's life. She paused at the doorway, watching the rise and fall of the small chest, and felt a pang of bittersweet affection. Love existed, but always filtered through duty and expectation. It was a love that demanded endurance and discipline, never unguarded joy. The drawing room called to her, its emptiness both comforting and confining. She approached the window, pressing her hands against the cold glass. Outside, the fog enveloped the street lamps in ghostly halos. The Thames was a dark ribbon, winding silently beneath the mist. She thought of the world beyond, a world of choice, of freedom, of possibility. It seemed impossibly distant, a life she had glimpsed only in dreams. At her writing desk, hidden behind a velvet drape, lay the tools of her clandestine rebellion. Inkpots, quills, and journals waited patiently for her touch. She began to write, letting her thoughts flow freely for the first time all day. Each word was a sigh, a whisper, a declaration. I am here. I exist. I feel. The letters she wrote were never sent. They were tucked away in drawers, beneath folded lace handkerchiefs, or sewn into the hems of skirts. Some were poems, delicate and aching. Others were letters to imagined friends, women who might understand the weight of a day measured in obedience and silent endurance. In her words, she found a world where she was not invisible, where she could speak without fear, where her thoughts were not possessions of another. The house itself seemed alive with secrets. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The grandfather clock's slow tick became a companion, a metronome to her private thoughts. She could almost imagine it counting her dreams rather than the hours of duty. Sometimes, in these moments of solitude, she allowed herself small acts of defiance. A flower plucked from the garden without permission, a book opened under the blanket, pages read in secret while the house slept, a note scrawled with ink smudged by the tears she did not shed in public. Each act was a silent protest, a claim to her own existence in a world that demanded invisibility. Even the act of dreaming was revolutionary. She imagined herself walking freely through the streets, shedding corsets and gloves, her laughter loud and unashamed. She imagined conversations unguarded, friendships unfettered, choices made by her alone. And though she knew the morning would return her to duty, these fleeting flights of imagination were hers and hers alone. Sometimes she imagined other women doing the same, in homes across London. Perhaps they too wrote letters they would never send. Perhaps they too sat by their windows, tracing shapes in the condensation, yearning for a life beyond expectation. In that thought, she found kinship, a quiet sisterhood born not of social gatherings, but of shared endurance and hidden courage. The candle burned low. Her hands paused over the paper, ink drying into a testament of her resilience. The night outside whispered promises she could not yet claim. And still, in the dim glow of her private world, she felt a fragile triumph. Though society had caged her in manners, duty, and silence, she had found a way to speak. She had found a way to exist fully within the limits imposed upon her. Before retiring to her chamber, she lingered a moment longer at the window. The fog had thickened, hiding the streets from view. For a brief second, the world felt suspended, neither past nor future, neither duty nor expectation. In that pause, she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow I will exist again, and perhaps in the quiet I will be freer than I was today." As the candle guttered and the clock ticked its relentless rhythm, she finally returned to her bed, corset loosened slightly, mind alight with the words she had written, the dreams she had dared to imagine, and the quiet, unyielding courage of a Victorian wife whose rebellion was measured in whispers, ink, and hope. Victorian whispers, first sparks of rebellion. Dawn was pale and hesitant, spilling gray light across the rooftops of London. Inside the grand house, the mistress moved with her usual precision, tending the fire, arranging flowers, and overseeing the breakfast preparations. But today, something had shifted, a subtle, imperceptible tremor beneath her composed exterior. She lingered over the morning tea, stirring it absent-mindedly. The steam rose in soft curls, and for a fleeting moment she imagined lifting the cup to her lips not out of duty, but desire, truly savoring it, letting herself taste the warmth without concern for manners. It was a small act, almost meaningless to anyone else, but to her it was rebellion. The husband entered, voice brisk, businesslike. "Tea, my dear?" he asked. She nodded, offering a practiced smile. But her hands, steady as ever, trembled slightly at the edges. No one would notice. After breakfast, she retreated to her writing desk. Today, she decided, the letters would no longer remain unfinished. She wrote with a deliberate courage, each word a declaration: "I think, I feel, I question." The pen moved quickly, inscribing her inner life onto the page, no longer merely whispering in secrecy, but asserting itself in confident, bold strokes. The garden called to her next. Normally, she wandered among the roses with measured care, never touching more than what was expected of her. But today, she bent to pick a small wildflower, one that had grown beyond the planned rose. Its petals were delicate, almost fragile, and yet she held it as if she were holding her own defiance. Later, the day unfolded as usual. The servants attended to their duties, the child napped, the house seemed normal from the outside. But inside, the mistress's mind was awake in ways it had not been before. She lingered over books she had once feared to open, passages marked with tiny slips of paper to remind her she was more than the roles imposed upon her. She read about women who had dared to think freely, who had dared to speak, who had dared to live beyond expectation. By afternoon, a visitor arrived, a neighbor, another wife. Their conversation began with pleasantries, the polite exchanges that Victorian society demanded. But soon their words slipped into something more honest, more dangerous. They spoke of books they had read, of ideas they could not share openly, of the exhaustion of playing the obedient, perfect wife. In those fleeting moments, the world outside ceased to exist. For a few precious minutes, they were not prisoners of lace and expectation. They were simply women, thinking aloud, daring to breathe freely. Even the simplest gestures became statements of autonomy. She lingered at the window longer than necessary, watching life move beyond her walls. She laughed softly at a thought, a real, unguarded laugh, and felt its weight, unfamiliar and exhilarating. As evening descended, she returned to her chamber, candlelight flickering across the walls. The journal lay open, waiting. Tonight she would write not merely to unburden, but to claim herself. Each sentence was a step into the world she had been forbidden to enter, a world of thought, choice, and self-possession. The night deepened. Outside, London slumbered under its grey mist. Inside, the Victorian wife dared, for the first time, to imagine a future not dictated by duty, but by desire, curiosity, and courage. And though the path was invisible, and the walls of society remained strong, she felt a new power taking root, a quiet, persistent strength that could not be ignored, that could not be confined. In the soft flicker of candlelight, with pen in hand and heart alight, she realized something extraordinary. Silence could be a weapon, and words could be a revolution.
The morning fog had lifted, leaving the streets of London pale and glimmering with dew. Inside the house, the mistress moved among her duties with her usual grace. Yet today, the rhythm of her day carried a subtle defiance. Every gesture, every glance, hinted at the quiet rebellion that had begun to take shape. She lingered longer than usual at the window, tracing the outlines of distant rooftops and imagining streets she could walk freely. A servant glanced her way, but saw only the familiar, polite smile. No one noticed the small act of resistance, the stretching of time to savor a fleeting moment of her own. Her writing desk now held letters meant to be shared. Carefully folded, they were addressed to friends in other households, women who might understand the weight of imposed perfection. Each envelope was sealed not only with wax, but with courage. She had begun to trust that her words, though hidden from the public eye, could reach others and inspire silent solidarity. By mid-afternoon, the visitor, a neighbor similarly trapped in the gilded cage of expectation, arrived. Tea was served, conversation polite and measured, but soon they found themselves talking more freely, their words dipping into territory considered improper for women. Politics, literature, and ideas of independence. They exchanged knowing looks and quiet laughter at the absurdities of the rules that bound them. The walls of the room seemed to close in, but within those walls, freedom blossomed. Later, the mistress ventured into the garden, stepping carefully among the ordered flower beds. She bent to lift a small wild flower that had grown between the neatly trimmed roses, a tiny act of disobedience. She pressed it to her chest, feeling an unspoken thrill at claiming something for herself, however small. Every petal became a symbol, a life beyond constraint, a heart that could still choose. The children's laughter floated from the nursery, innocent and untainted by the burdens of society. She paused, imagining a future where they might grow up without the invisible chains she bore. Perhaps her rebellion, small as it was, might plant seeds of courage in them too. Evening arrived with its familiar cadence. Candles were lit, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The husband returned, his presence commanding, yet she met him with the expected smile, concealing the subtle fire that had ignited within her. She poured his tea, arranged the evening meal, and laughed at his jokes with practiced precision. Yet beneath that veneer, her mind raced with strategies, ideas, and dreams, possibilities of a life lived fully. Before retiring, she returned to her writing desk. Tonight, her journal would hold not just reflections, but plans, tiny acts of resistance she could perform the next day. Perhaps a new book to read, a conversation with another wife to inspire thought, a subtle assertion of taste or opinion in the drawing room. Each was a thread in the tapestry of quiet revolution she was beginning to weave. The candle flickered low, shadows stretching across the walls like silent witnesses. She closed the journal and pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. In the silent hours of the night, she realized that her rebellion was no longer confined to ink and imagination. It was present in her gaze, her choices, her movements. Every small act mattered. As London slept, the Victorian wife, once silenced, had begun to assert her voice, not with outrage, not with spectacle, but with deliberate, patient, and unyielding courage. The walls of duty and decorum remained formidable, yet the fire inside her had become undeniable, flickering with quiet promise that one day perhaps it would illuminate the world beyond her gilded cage.
Victorian Whispers, the first challenge. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows, casting long, soft shadows across the drawing room. Today felt different. Though nothing had changed outwardly, the mistress sensed a shift within herself. A quiet audacity had taken root, one that could no longer be contained entirely in journals and secret letters. The day began with the usual precision. Servants moved like clockwork, children played in measured bursts, and her husband left for the club, oblivious to the subtle storm growing in the heart of his home. But she did not immediately return to routine. Instead, she lingered in the library, lifting a book from the shelf, a text she had previously considered forbidden by propriety. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The ideas on these worn leaves spoke of freedom, intellect, and choice. For the first time, she read not merely to escape, but to understand the world she might inhabit if she dared act. And she decided she would act, even in small ways. By mid-morning, she hosted a gathering of women from nearby households. At first, conversation followed the expected norms: tea, polite smiles, discussion of the latest fashions. But gradually the mistress guided the discussion toward literature, education, and the possibilities for women beyond domestic confines. Some ladies hesitated, fear evident in their polite eyes. Others, inspired by her courage, began to speak more freely, sharing small frustrations and secret aspirations. One woman dared to ask aloud, "Do we not deserve a say in the world outside our parlors?" The room held a breathless silence. No one laughed. No one scolded. Instead, nods and murmurs of agreement quietly passed among them. In that brief moment, the invisible chains of expectation seemed to loosen. The mistress smiled softly, knowing that courage was contagious, even when spoken in whispers. Later, she ventured into the garden, her steps deliberate. She allowed herself to wander beyond the paths, touching plants she had never been permitted to prune or pick. Each action, small as it seemed, was a statement, a claim to space, to autonomy, to life lived by her own judgment. The wildflowers she gathered were tucked carefully into her apron, a token of defiance, a secret of ownership that belonged solely to her. The afternoon was spent mentoring one of the younger servants, a bright girl curious about the wider world. She taught her to read passages from books she herself had only recently discovered. Knowledge, she realized, was a quiet weapon, one that could be shared, nurtured, and passed down. Evening fell with the familiar cadence of candlelight and the husband's return. Conversation resumed its usual politeness, yet the mistress carried a subtle confidence in her movements and speech. A carefully chosen word here, a deliberate pause there. These were her first small forays into self-assertion. She had begun to practice the art of invisible leadership, commanding respect without confrontation. At night, the journal waited. She recorded the day's events, reflecting on the courage she had summoned and the tiny victories achieved. Letters were drafted to other women in secret, offering advice, encouragement, and solidarity. She realized that true rebellion did not always roar. It could whisper, spread quietly, and change lives one act at a time. The city outside rested under a soft blanket of fog. Within the walls of the house, a revolution was quietly stirring, not of swords and banners, but of thoughts, words, and subtle defiance. The Victorian wife, once silenced, was beginning to lead. And as the candle flickered and shadows danced along the walls, she understood a profound truth. To survive in silence was necessary, but to begin to act in courage, even in the smallest ways, was freedom. Victorian Whispers, the first confrontation. The morning was crisp, and the London fog had begun to lift, revealing streets bustling with commerce and conversation. Inside the grand house, the mistress moved with her usual elegance, but today each step carried a quiet defiance that no one dared question, until the world began to notice. Her letters, once safely hidden, had been delivered in secret to a trusted circle of women. Small, discreet gatherings had grown bolder, discussions spanning not only literature and education, but the very rules that bound them to invisible chains. Word had spread, quietly, like a ripple across the drawing rooms of London. The first challenge came in the form of a glance, a neighbor's subtle disapproval, a whispered remark overheard by the servants. "I hear the ladies of this street are becoming unspoken," one matron remarked, eyes narrowed. The mistress smiled politely, hiding the satisfaction of being noticed. Recognition, she realized, was the first step toward change, even if it came with caution. At home, the husband returned from the club earlier than usual, his expression tense. The house seemed to hold its breath. She greeted him with composure, but there was a sparkle in her eye, a silent assertion of thought and agency he had not seen before. When he commented on her new arrangement of flowers, wild blossoms placed carelessly among the ordered beds, she replied lightly, "I thought it might brighten the garden." Her tone was innocent, yet unyielding. He frowned, but said nothing. For once, her choice was her own, and it remained unchallenged. Later, a small group of neighbors arrived, women emboldened by her courage. They spoke quietly, but their words were pointed. "Must we always bow to tradition?" one asked. Another added, "Are our minds not our own?" The mistress listened, nodded, and responded thoughtfully, carefully guiding the conversation toward ideas of education, reading, and self-expression. Every word was a lesson in subtle leadership, every pause a demonstration of power tempered with grace. By afternoon, she had implemented a small act of independence. She sent her daughter to a nearby tutor, disregarding the older, restrictive expectations that girls of her class should be educated only in manners and music. It was a minor defiance, yet to the household it was revolutionary. The daughter beamed, unaware of the weight of her mother's courage, yet carrying the first seeds of freedom. Even the servants felt the shift. The young maid, who had been timid and uncertain, now moved with a hint of confidence, encouraged by the mistress's small but deliberate acts of rebellion. A simple nod, a shared smile, or a whispered word of encouragement became threads in a growing web of quiet empowerment. As evening fell, the mistress sat at her desk, candlelight flickering across her carefully written journal. Today had brought her first confrontation, not with anger or overt criticism, but with the subtle resistance of society itself. Yet in that confrontation lay victory. She had chosen her words, her actions, and her thoughts deliberately. She had exercised control over the one realm she could, her mind, her voice, her choices. London slept beneath a soft mist, unaware of the quiet revolution happening behind lace curtains and polished doors. Within the house, the Victorian wife closed her journal with a sense of triumph. The walls of duty remained, but the cracks were forming. Small acts of courage, once invisible, were now stirring recognition, and with recognition came possibility. And as she extinguished the candle, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning. The world may watch, but it cannot stop what has already begun within me." The Victorian city outside continued its relentless rhythm. Carriages clattering over cobblestones, merchants calling out their wares, men discussing politics in brisk tones. Yet inside the grand house, a quieter, subtler revolution had begun. What started as private musings and small acts of defiance was now stirring awareness both within the household and among the neighbors. The morning began as always, but a tension hovered in the air. Servants exchanged cautious glances. Even the children seemed attuned to the subtle difference in their mother's movements. The mistress herself felt it. Each decision now carried weight beyond the household, a ripple into the rigid world that sought to contain her. A letter arrived, delivered by a young girl who seemed nervous for the first time. Its contents were simple but potent. Other women had begun meeting in secret, inspired by her courage. They shared ideas, recommended books, and spoke openly for the first time about aspirations and frustrations. The mistress read each line carefully, her heart swelling with quiet pride. Her rebellion, once confined to ink and private thought, was no longer hers alone. But as her influence grew, so did scrutiny. A neighbor, once friendly, now observed her with thinly veiled suspicion. "I hear your daughters are being taught things beyond decorum," she whispered to another matron during a tea gathering. The words traveled, as they always did, and soon the social landscape shifted subtly, alert to the mistress's quiet audacity. Within the household, small acts became tests of courage. She insisted on arranging the flowers differently, placing wildflowers alongside roses. She selected books for her children that explored ideas beyond their class and gender. She allowed herself laughter that lingered longer than politeness dictated. Each minor defiance attracted attention, but she persisted. One afternoon, the husband returned unexpectedly. He noticed the letters on the desk, the books in the drawing room. His brow furrowed, his tone clipped. "Are these really necessary?" he asked, but she met his gaze evenly, calm and unwavering. "Knowledge is necessary," she replied softly. "Not defiance, not confrontation, but an assertion of choice." Evening gatherings brought new challenges. Women who attended her small circles were both emboldened and wary. They spoke more freely than ever before, their words tinged with anxiety, laughter, and relief. In those moments, the mistress realized the true power of her rebellion. It inspired courage in others. One woman admitted, I never thought I could speak my mind, yet here I do." By nightfall, the house seemed charged with invisible electricity. The walls, once symbols of confinement, now reflected determination and quiet pride. The Victorian wife had begun to teach others the art of measured rebellion, how to assert agency while preserving safety, how to plant seeds of thought in minds that had long been restrained. As she sat by the candlelight, writing in her journal, she reflected on the day, subtle victories, small confrontations, growing networks of courage. The city outside was unaware of the quiet revolution blooming in parlors, gardens, and drawing rooms. Her mind lingered on one thought, profound and daring. Society can watch, it can scold, it can constrain, but it cannot stop the courage that begins in the heart. Once awakened, it spreads like wildfire, quietly, irrevocably. The candle flickered, shadows danced along the walls, and for the first time she felt not imprisoned, but alive. Alive in defiance, in thought, in small, deliberate courage that promised change. Victorian Whispers, the final awakening. The dawn broke slowly over London, spilling a soft golden light across the cobblestone streets. Fog lingered in the alleys like memories of whispered secrets, fading only as the morning unfolded. Inside the grand house, the mistress rose quietly, her movements fluid and deliberate. Each gesture carried weight, each breath a subtle declaration of self-possession. Today was not merely another day. It was a culmination of years of thought, patience, and quiet rebellion. She walked past the mirrors, pausing to observe her reflection. The woman staring back was no longer merely the silent wife, the dutiful daughter, the careful observer of propriety. She was fully herself, aware, daring, strong. Every line of her face told a story of endurance. Every flicker of her eyes hinted at untold courage. The corset still hugged her waist, the layers of lace and silk remained, but they no longer felt like chains. They were armor, symbols of a world she had mastered from within, not a prison that confined her.